Good morning. Welcome to Trinity Episcopal Parish's class over the history of Christian worship. The past couple of classes we've been talking about marriage, and we've been fairly non-descriptive as to practices in actual ceremonies. And for you who have been waiting for us to get to this point, as we usually do in describing the ceremonies of the worship, you will undoubtedly be happy to know that we are finally going to talk about marriage ceremonies. What they look like, what they start to take on culturally, and how, specifically in the medieval time period, these ceremonies were understood. As we talked about before, the early church had a fairly touch-and-go relationship with marriage as necessarily being a church-centric sanctioning. As we talked about last time, even in the early church, the heresy of Gnosticism was actually very dismissive of marriage and actually dismissive of it as an evil thing rather than a good thing. St. Augustine of Hippo, of course, writes the goods of marriage as a rebuttal against this. But even still, the values of monastic life were seen as a higher holiness virtue than marriage. This will indeed continue to be the case really until we get to the Reformation. But that's for next time. What we're going to talk about right now are some of the written records for church blessings of marriage in the early medieval time period. Now, we have to recognize, once again, like we talked about at the very end of last video, the ways that ritual is employed within worship is often conditioned by the culture that one lives in. There's nothing wrong about this. God uses all kinds of things in the worship of God. This is especially the case if you read the book of Exodus or Leviticus. Using stuff to worship God in specific ways is not wrong. It just means that we have to think very differently than how we might think about it in our contemporary view. When we think about the medieval time period, we have to think, number one, about the established church. This is, of course, important because when you are a Catholic Christian, which is the only kind of Christian that you could be before the 1000s, to be a Christian of the whole universal tradition, there were certain ways that you did things. However, when it comes to marriage, marriage was far more malleable as it comes to cultural practice than, let's say, the Holy Eucharist was. The Holy Eucharist and baptism were far more particular because of the particular descriptions that we have within the Bible itself and within the early tradition. Marriage, however, takes on various forms and various ceremonial aspects to it that, of course, are borrowed and brought forward from the tradition that the church inherits, both from the early Jewish and Hebrew tradition, as well as the early church tradition. But as we start talking about ceremony specifically, we now start talking about how do we arrange all of these various elements, themes, and Christian faith, the worship of the triune God, into a ceremony that blesses the marriage of two families. Let's take a look at an actual marriage rite that exists within the medieval time period. This is going to come from around the 900s, the very early medieval time period. There was a marriage ceremony in one of the service manuals that is sometimes referred to as a sacramentary, but the particular manual that we're looking at is something called the Liber Ordinum. And within this particular service book, we have a description of an actual marriage ceremony. However, before we get there, notice that this particular marriage ceremony is what we would refer to as a domestic rite. This is not a ceremony that's taking place in an actual church building. This is taking place in the home that the soon-to-be married will be inhabiting together. So whenever I say the word domestic rite, this is merely describing that this is not happening necessarily in a church building. This is called the Pontifical of Egbert, which is a 9th century order of marriage that is a domestic rite. Here's what the structure of this looks like. Pay close attention to some of the elements. You have an opening with the Aaronic Blessing. So the Aaronic Blessing is the blessing that was attributed to Aaron, the high priest of the Old Testament, which is, the Lord bless you and keep you, the Lord make his face to shine upon you and grant you peace, the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you rest. This particular blessing form is referred to as the Aaronic Blessing, but that's the first thing you open with. Then you have a type of blessing that invokes a particularly kind of a formulaic attribution to the Trinity. This is similar to what we would refer to in the Episcopal Church and other liturgical churches as a collect type blessing. One that has a doxology to the Trinity, one that prays for specific things after extolling God for God's goodness. Then we have several blessings in a row. We have the blessing of the bed chamber. Remember that here in just a moment. Then we have the blessing of the couple. Then we have the blessing of a ring. A ring. We have the blessing of the bed within the bed chamber. And then we have the blessing of the Trinity. These blessings cover specific places within the domestic household. The chamber, the bed chamber, where the married couple will inhabit, but also, just to be blunt, where they will have marital relations, where they will have sexual intercourse, and where they will, by God's good grace in this prayer format, hopefully bear healthy children. The blessing of the chamber, as well as the blessing of the bed, is of course tied to, again, the continuing of the family line, the continuing of the name of the family. This, of course, is a marriage value that was common between the Old Testament and New Testament, and brought forward into the early church rites as well as an understanding of the goods of marriage, as St. Augustine said. But also you have the blessing of the couple. That's nothing unusual. But then we have the blessing of a ring. One. In some early marriage rites, the ring was a betrothal offering given to the woman, because that ring would be made of precious metals and things like that. And it was honestly, in some cases, used as insurance. Because in the cultures, especially in the Roman culture, the husband could break off the marriage really with no particular reason. And the woman would be left basically with nothing. Because remember, at this point in time in history, women could really not own anything. And women were treated in a very real sense as property. And so in the ring that was given, there are some cultures that used this as insurance in order to protect the woman, because if she was let go by a ne'er-do-well husband, she had something of value that she would be able to sell in order to get a boost on a new livelihood. Now, of course, this is, to us in modern day is egregious, and it should strike us as egregious that this should be the case. But the reason why this one ring is used in this rite is very likely because it is insurance for the woman. That's why there's not two of them yet. But the ring serves as, of course, a symbol of perpetuity, that this is, indeed, this marriage is supposed to be a lifelong covenant, a lifelong relationship. But it also had a, dare I say, practical use as well as an insurance. And so in this particular domestic blessing, what's going on is that it is a very short ceremony. There's not a lot of stuff going on in it. In a lot of ways, it's very simply a house blessing for the joining together of these two people under the invocation of the Trinity, of God in three persons, i.e. Christianity made domestic. And so this was not unusual for this particular 900s ceremony. However, in the later Middle Ages, in the later medieval time period, we also have an ecclesial rite. We have one that is a church rite that happens within the confines of the actual worshiping assembly assembled in their worship building. Now, this one comes from the 12th century, around the 1100s. This one is an Anglo-Norman rite, so we're starting to move closer and closer to the British Isles as we start examining some of our European ancestry in this case. And you'll notice that I'm focusing on the European context because this is where the medieval church has most of its influence. This Anglo-Norman rite has some additional things within it that are particular to its setting. We're no longer just in the house, now we're in a church. The way that the ceremony begins, the partners are asked, are they willing to be married? You have the blessing of a single ring. Then you have a gift-giving ceremony of the man giving gifts to the woman. And part of this ceremony also harkens back to the giving of gifts to the woman as a sign of one's betrothal or as a sign of one's dowry. A dowry was a particular set of goods or money to be given as payment for the right for marriage. At the very simplest, sometimes this could be seen as a simple exchange of property, but it also could be seen as a token of one's investment in the marriage. As one person has pointed out, it is much harder to get out of something that someone has invested in than something that someone has no investment or equity being put in. Of course, this is a very practical way of looking at this, but nonetheless it's important. The giving of gifts to the woman. Then the ring is given using the blessing of the Trinitarian formula. In other words, the ring is not simply an insurance type of thing. It's not simply a symbol of lifelong perpetuity. It now becomes a token and symbol of the marriage being consummated in the name of the Trinity. It's given as a token and sign, as a deeply Christian symbol now, and not just as a token. The bride then kneels before the groom as a sign of, and of course we have to think about where we're at this time, as a sign of the bride giving herself over to her husband's charge and control. The submission of the wife to the husband, which was not something that was questioned at this time. Then you have short blessings over several different things, such as the families of the married couple, such as the couple themselves, things like this. But then the thing that makes this a church rite is that then you have the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. You have the celebration of the Mass. In other words, the ceremony of the marriage itself now is fully encompassed within the life of the worshiping community, because this vow seen between these two people is now also caught up within the sacramental context of the Mass itself, which is a really important move at this point in time, because this affects the way that we understand Christian marriage in a lot of ways, even to modern day. That the sacramental aspects of marriage are caught up in the regular worship of the church. That marriage is a worship ceremony, as well as a blessing ceremony for a domestic joining together of families. After the Eucharist is had, the nuptial blessing is pronounced. And the nuptial blessing, in a very simple sense, is the blessing of the cleric onto these two people, that they may become one before God. That God is an actor in all of this, making that explicit in the nuptial blessing. Then, at the home, then you have a domestic rite, where this marriage ceremony continues with, at the home, the bedchamber is blessed. So there is a domestic element at the end of this particular ceremony, but the large encompassing bit of that rite is within the church itself. So notice the differences between these two rites, the domestic rite and this church rite. The domestic rite, it's all in the home. It's all about the blessing of various things about these two people coming together as a family. The church rite, however, makes explicit the cultural things that are happening, of the dowry being given in an actual liturgical form in the church, of the ring being given not just as insurance anymore, but now as a token and sign of the blessing of the Trinity. And the whole thing being caught up in the context of the Mass. It is a church ceremony in the sacramental worship of the church. You see how different this is from the domestic blessing, and even from the early church that had no specific instructions as to doing this within the context of the church itself. So the importance of this rite in the 1100s is very, very important, because it makes a shift culturally in the way that we understand Christian marriages, right? Well, let's look at one more, because here's where a big move happens in our particular heritage in the Catholic tradition, which is the Serum Manual. Now, the Serum Manual, for us as Anglicans, is very important, because this is sometimes referred to as the use of Salisbury, and this particular use is an actual manual for how you are to do church worship. So when we refer to the Serum Manual, this is something specific to the British Isles. And this is something that influences the way that English culture is going to understand marriage going forward. But here's what the Serum Manual says. You have what was referred to as the final banns of marriage being given. In other words, this is what you see in a lot of movies that brings some various level of either comedy or some level of trepidation, which is the final pronunciation of, if there is any reason why these two people should not be married, come forward now and make it known. In other words, look around. Is there anyone who objects to this? That's what the final banns of marriage is. That's the very beginning. Does anybody object to this? Then you have the double consent. This one's really important. The double consent, it is both the consent of the man and also the woman. Does the man consent? Does the woman consent? This is new in this particular culture. The double consent is really important because it is a consensual relationship. While this might not change a bunch of things culturally, such as women's rights to owning of property or things like that at this moment, at least within the marriage ceremony itself, there is indeed a value of mutuality that gets brought out specifically in this liturgical formula of the double consent that was not in these rites before. So both parties have to consent to this. Then the priest then gives the woman to the man after the double consent. Now notice the priest does this because what is beginning to happen within these rites is that no longer is the joining of these people together, at least liturgically outward in worship, simply a family-making contractual agreement, but rather the priest as serving in the person of Christ in joining these two people together. As Jesus Christ himself said, what God has joined together, let no one put asunder. So you have a little bit of a difference there too, a little bit of a modification of the giving of the woman to the man, where you have this seen as an actual, both a mutual relationship, but also as something that is an action of God at this point. Not that it wasn't before, but in the worship patterns of the liturgy, it's made explicit by this action. Then you have the vows said to each other. What do the married couple vow to each other? These vows include fidelity, include loyalty, include the explicit saying of this is going to be a lifelong covenant. It sounds very Augustinian, right? So Augustine of Hippo, once again, this is how the church goes with these types of things. And the being open to bearing of children. Blessing of the ring. Again, it's a ring. So we still have the single ring. We don't have two of them yet. We still have the ring. And the giving of this ring, of course, with the blessing of the triune formula. You have the blessings over the couple, the pronunciation of the blessings on the family, and then once again, this is a church rite. You have the Mass, which of course encompasses all of this stuff within a sacramental act of the church. You have the nuptial blessing with an interesting little flare, which is a pall or a canopy over the top of the couple, symbolizing that they are one household now. They are one house. And that this nuptial blessing, once again, is a blessing formula that it is God joining these people together. And then, once again, you have a domestic action, which is the prayers at the home of the couple. These include various prayers for, of course, the bedchamber, the bed, all these various things that are more, domestic in action and are, again, a domestic part of the liturgy, but the main part of the liturgy is a church rite. So what do we see within these marriage rites? Several things need to be noted. The first thing is that we have an actual formula for marriage that we're starting to see. We're seeing that it is important enough to know how to do this, that these are making it into these worship manuals. But secondly, the rites of the marriage shift from being only a domestic rite in which blessings are said over the couple at their home and over the things at their home. It then transfers into a church rite that is then consummated and coupled with the sacramental life of the church, particularly in the chief manner of worship of the church, which is the Mass. The shift between these two things, as in some cases centralizing the marriage relationship within the church itself, within its worship itself, is a particular kind of value, right? It is making explicit the connection between God and the sacraments of Christ Jesus and the life of the married couple themselves. That this sacramental life is encompassing this type of realm, you could say. And the value within this is that where do you get your marriages done if you are Christian? It starts being in church, because the marriage ceremony begins to become a public worship ceremony, as well as being a domestic rite. So you see this melding of these two things together, which is something that is relatively novel at this time, but again is influenced by the way that things move forward. These are the early rites that we see within the European and British Isles. Now, the Reformation is right around the corner, and one particular thing needs to be said once again. Marriage was not seen as the highest holiness that one could attain to. Celibacy was seen as a higher holiness. The reason why this is important to understand within this is that when we get to the Reformation, the reformers are going to flip-flop this in some very real ways. That the celibacy or the holiness brought on by one's celibate nature is going to come into question, especially by one of the biggest names of the Reformation, none other than Martin Luther himself. But that's for next time, friends. Thank you so much for joining us for our history of Christian worship over Christian marriage. Once again, next time we'll be talking about the Reformation and the changes that were brought from our reformers. But until then, friends, be safe, and may God bless you.